Good morning. Good morning. Thank you all for joining us this morning. And what I'm going to do, in a lot of ways, my talk, and I have a few images. The one thing I've learned from teaching, when you read those evaluations at the end of the semesters, the kids say, she needs 4 PowerPoints, she needs images. So, I keep the kiddies happy and I give them what they ask for on occasion. So I do have a few images that I'll share with you today as I sort of give a talk, Sisters and Friends, African American Women in the Antebellum North. A lot of the things that I'll talk about today will connect with Carol's talk. I am going to sort of back us up a little bit in time and look a little bit at the sort of earlier part of the antebellum era, these years leading up to the Civil War, in part because the women that I'm going to focus on today really wrote most of their poems, their writings in the 1840s and 50s. But of course, sort of talking about freedom, African American women, and this sort of movement to the Civil War clearly does bring us to the war, but I'm probably going to focus a little bit more on the antebellum era, but we'll see where we go or where we get to with this talk. The mid-19th century was perhaps one of the most complicated eras for African Americans, both men and women, specifically in the urban north. And my talk today really will focus on sort of urban areas throughout the north. So we'll shift sort of where Angelina Grimke, picking up the city of Philadelphia and looking at others who inhabit that space. Although constantly faced with mounting inequalities and the persistent struggle to end the institution of slavery within the United States, African American men and women continue to redefine themselves as free people. And later on we'll look at some documents, really cartoons, and sort of talk about what redefining your personhood looks like in the 19th century, or at least the struggle to do that looks like in the 19th century. A founding of free African American religious organizations and educational facilities dating back to the 18th century gave rise to a very politically active black elite in cities such as Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. Not only did African American men and women struggle to free themselves from the vestiges of slavery, but they also experienced dynamic socioeconomic transition connected to this new century. From slave to indentured servant to free people or wage earner, men and women of African descent found themselves confronted with a changing urban and rural landscape. And the black elite juggled this sort of precarious nature of their freedom with a sort of new developing bourgeois culture. Women within the African American elite saw their families, their communities, and themselves in a perpetual state of motion. Things were sort of changing constantly. As wives and mothers, black women juggled the responsibilities of domestic duties within their own households, while simultaneously maintaining employment outside of the home. And unlike many white women of the Philadelphia elite and New York elite, African American women were forced to earn additional income in an effort to support their families, often finding work as teachers, nurses, and caterers. So what we see, even in these sort of early decades of the antebellum era, is that there's a need for two wage earners, even within the black elite. So this sort of luxury of not having to work was not really sort of a frequent phenomenon for African American women. The lives of African American women were filled not only with work inside and outside of the home, but with additional charity work as well. Abolitionist activism that I'll get to in a moment, and religious work or devotion as well. All of these things sort of came together to benefit the black communities in the urban north. And they simultaneously worked to transform the negative stereotypes of African American women. As these women constructed their personal and public spheres, respectability, as well as sentimentality, became central within their social circles. The world of friendship and sisterly love helped to strengthen political networks and extended kinship ties across the mid-Atlantic. Now, one of the most interesting ways, one of the most interesting ways that many of these sort of elite black women fostered relationships between themselves was through the creation of friendship albums. And this is an example of one of the friendship albums that I'll speak to today. So when I try to explain this to my students, when they say, well, what's a friendship album? What does it look like in the 19th century? I sort of liken it to the yearbook. So your 12th graders, they get their yearbooks, you run, you pick it up, of course you look to your page first, right? But then your job is to do what? It's to give it to your friends, right? And then your friends take it and what do? They write some, I don't know, long or perhaps short comment or sort of thoughts about their relationship to you. And then you take it back and you give it to your next friend. Right? That's what these friendship albums were like in the 19th century and that were kept by both African American and white women. So in the case of Amy Matilda Cassey, who I'll get to in a moment, this was the way in which she connected to her friends, and her friends would often write things that were very sentimental to her. And this spanned over time, so the album dates starting in the 1830s all the way up through the 1850s. So it gives us an idea of what her relationships looked like over time and who wrote in these albums and what they wrote as well. As friendship albums were passed from friend to friend along the East Coast, the display of immaculate penmanship, proper grammar and spelling, along with respectable prose regarding both the private and the political, allowed African Americans to define and reinforce their own respectability within their own social circles. As the albums traveled from Baltimore to Philadelphia and as far north as Boston, educated African Americans established a protocol discussing issues such as freedom, womanhood, and once again, respectability. Only 4 friendship albums belonging to 19th century African American women exist or remain intact. And this is the cover of one of them. So there are only 4 that, at least, that we've unearthed at this point. Amy Cassey, Martina and Mary Ann Dickerson, and Mary Virginia Wood Fortin. All members of the Antebellum elite have left us with these albums, and they really serve as these unique historical treasure chests. When I was a graduate student, I was at the Library Company of Philadelphia, which has a wonderful collection. And I sort of know one of the curators there, and I was sitting there. This is the graduate student's dream. He walked over, he said, we just acquired something in our collection. I think you might be interested in it. I said, oh, okay, great. And he pulls out 3 of the 4 friendship albums that no one had seen, no scholar had really sort of written on them. So I'm sitting there with my little gloves on, like, oh, okay, here's the dissertation, or at least part of it. And it was one of those moments where it allowed, and Carol brought this up earlier, it allowed me the opportunity to see the personal writings of so many African American women that are often lost. It's very difficult to find primary sources. Whenever you're doing women's history, and then you double that with doing African American history, finding sources that are really from the person themselves, as opposed to sort of reading between the lines of other primary documents, is always very exhilarating. So that was my the best moment in graduate school for me, to see these albums. Historians are often, myself included, forced to interpret sources that are written and maintained by people who are not of African descent. So additional sources for African American women often come from their public writings, usually in the forms of newspapers and pamphlets, as well as minutes from local and national organizations. And this is, as I said, a relatively recent discovery that helps us look into the private worlds of kinship and friendship. The album also stands as an emblem of this very sort of blurred private arena within the African American elite. In many ways, these albums, as we know with our with your yearbook, it's important that you get your friends to write it. But what's almost more important is what they write, right, in the album. And not only that, it's your private yearbook, but it's sort of public in that you pass it from friend to friend, right? So you know that when you get the yearbook to write it for your friends, what are you going to do? You're going to read it first, right? You're going to see, oh, what did Mary write? What did Joe write? And then it sort of helps you to craft whatever it is that you're going to write to your friend. And this was exactly the case that we see with Amy Matilda Cassey's album. Her album was not held for 30 minutes or an hour at a time. Her friends from across the eastern seaboard would take her album for months at a time and hold on to it until the next time they encountered one another. But it's clear from reading the album that everyone's informed by what her friends write. So in many ways, it sort of blurs this world between the private and the public. Philadelphia is the site for Amy Matilda's album, and for much of what I'll talk about today. It was arguably the most important northern community for free blacks in the infant years of the Republic. Philadelphia was an exciting epicenter of black community building. There was an existing support mechanism, in part established by a large Quaker presence, as Carol noted, as well as fledgling black institutions constructed by black men and women, a physical space for mobilization. The African American community of Philadelphia was significantly large for urban cities. In 1800, the total black population in Philadelphia, both enslaved and free, and there were still a few slaves running around in 1800, looked about 4,000. So about 4,000 folks living as free or enslaved people in Philadelphia. By 1830, these statistics changed in mushrooms. So we have about 14,000 all free African Americans living in the city of Philadelphia. So most scholars sort of look at that. We say, all right, well, that's a small, relatively small percentage of the city of Philadelphia. It's never more than 6% or what have you. But when you look at that number of 14,000 free blacks, 10,000 of them are women. So when we think about what the story is, or the way historians have crafted the African American experience in the 19th century in these urban areas, it's really the story of African American women, just from the numbers in places like Philadelphia. So the majority of the black population in Philadelphia were comprised of women. Generations of free black women who created and maintained friendship albums were the recipients of freedom and its privileges. For a small minority of black Philadelphians, freedom dated back to the Revolutionary War. For the majority, however, the dismantlement of slavery was an extremely gradual process. So when we look at the cities, we'll take Philadelphia as an example, the way that slavery ends in the North is a slow process. In Philadelphia, Pennsylvania rather, the Gradual Abolition Act is passed in 1780. And what does the law say? The law says that if you are born before March 1st, 1780, and you're enslaved, you'll remain a slave for the rest of your life, unless your master or mistress decides to set you free. If you're born on or after March 1st, 1780, you could only be held as a slave for 28 years. Okay? That's gradual. You know, when we think about what life expectancy rates looked like in the 1780s, you know, that's most of your life spent as a slave. However, by the 1780s and 1790s, we see this sort of gradual loosening of slavery. And then, of course, Massachusetts follows suit. New York does in 1799. New Jersey holds on for some time. But throughout these sort of early decades of the Antebellum era, we see slavery loosening and eventually disappearing. So the environment in which Amy Matilda Cassey is keeping her album is one that's seen slavery come, it's seen it sort of slowly disappear. And what pops up in its place is this weird sort of rebirth of indentured servitude. Many slave owners, not wanting to lose their slaves, emancipate them on their 27th birthday or 26th birthday. And then they indenture them for longer periods of time. And the folks who are indentured the longest were who? African American women. Why? Because when you think about port cities like Philadelphia, there was an extreme need for domestic servants. So the majority of these African American women are serving as servants in households. And so we see this slow transition from slavery to servitude and eventually to freedom. So that by the 1830s, 1840s, as we're moving towards the Civil War, slavery's dead in Pennsylvania, but clearly not next door in Delaware. And when we think about the proximity, the close proximity to these states, one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves is, what does it mean to be free in Pennsylvania, but right down the road, slavery is still alive and well in Wilmington or Newcastle, Delaware. A stone's throw away, an easy place to be kidnapped to in the 1830s and 40s. The content of friendship albums was of great sentimental importance to the owner. The reputation of those who wrote in albums were also of great significance. So this album that we have right here is bound in this sort of beautiful black Moroccan leather, gives us this entry into album culture. This is a current day picture really of Amy Matilda Cassey's home in Philadelphia, the sort of what we would call Old City in Philly now. Cassey was born in 1809 to a family of very well-established free African Americans in New York. She was the daughter of Reverend Peter Williams, who was a leader in the black community, and Cassey was married to a member of Philadelphia's black elite. In 1828, she marries Joseph Cassey. He was a wealthy hairdresser, an importer of perfumes. And one of the things that's interesting in looking at these networks of free blacks in the urban areas is that Joseph Cassey, is a lot older than Amy, several generations older. However, it was decided that he was a good match for Amy by her appearance. And one of the other things about Joseph Cassey was that he was very entrenched in the anti-slavery and abolitionist movement in Philadelphia. So when Amy moves to Philadelphia to marry, she automatically is sort of plugged into this abolitionist movement. Her husband is kind of old and has been sort of involved in this, in the work of anti-slavery. And she joins in as well. She also becomes very involved in black improvement societies, the creation of the first African American newspaper, Freedom's Journal. Joseph Cassey was a founding member of the American Anti-Slavery Society and was a sales agent for William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator. So clearly, which we've mentioned already earlier today, so there's clearly this real presence, this black abolitionist presence in the Cassey family and in her community. And this sort of makes me think about one of the comments that Carol made earlier in her presentation about why abolition works the way it does in the 1820s and 30s, and what it means to be an abolitionist. Why, as a Northerner, would you be so interested in this cause? And I think the answer about sort of soul, protecting one's soul or salvaging the soul is right on target. I think that for black abolitionists, there's a different agenda. I think clearly there's this issue about the salvaging of souls, but this is also about freeing family. This is about protecting yourself. This is about protecting your children who are in constant threat of being captured, kidnapped, and sold to the South, even though they had never been enslaved. And I think an interesting way to sort of look at what it means to be an abolitionist is, and we usually look at Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison as examples of this, and I'll sort of come to that. But I think when we talk about what it means to be an abolitionist and what the things are that are sort of driving you, that clearly for black abolitionists, there's another piece to this. It's about protecting one's family and protecting yourself. Following her marriage, Amy Cassey became involved in many reform movements and women's organizations. In 1833, she became a founding member of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, a place in which she would have met and interacted with Angelina Grimke. There were many connections, actually, between Amy Cassey and Grimke, and they traveled in many of the same circles. The Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society was one of the first interracial anti-slavery societies throughout the North. And I think this gets back to that point about what it means to be an abolitionist. Many abolitionist organizations were all white. The one in Philadelphia was not. It was interracial. She also became involved in the Moral Reform Association and others. She was also connected to local black improvement efforts, and both her and her husband became very involved with education for blacks in the city. Many of the entries recorded in 19th century friendship albums represent the written expression of love between female friends. In many cases, the sentimental expression appears in the form of a poem. In May of 1833, Sarah Louise Fortin, who was a daughter of the well-known Fortin mogul, he was a shipping mogul, he was one of the wealthiest Philadelphians, white or black. His daughter, Sarah Louise Fortin, wrote a poem in Amy's album. And this could very well have been shared in public, but it was never printed in one of the 19th century newspapers. I'm going to read a little bit of what she wrote in this album to Amy Cassey. She writes, "My prayer for thee, dearest, is warm from the heart, unmingled with flattery, unsullied by art. 'Tis the first fervent wishes I traced on this page. May they ever attend thee in youth and in age. I pray that thy pathway on earth may be bright, with love for thy motto and hope for the light. That the sunshine of bliss that now luminous the face, though the sad tear of sorrow may never give place." And here's the sort of important part. That the tide of affection unsullied may flow through the heart of thy husband in weal and in woe. As when first at the altar he gave thee his heart, from the love he then pledged, may he never depart. As Sarah Fortin expressed her well wishes to her friend, she touched upon several very common themes present in writings in the 19th century among women. In addition to sort of wishing her happiness, Fortin extended a hope for a healthy and a harmonious marriage for Cassey. And in many of these entries, the theme of marriage and family is central. She wished them well through the good and difficult times. However, she specifically wished that Cassey's husband had the ability to endure through the trials of marriage, that he never, quote, depart from the love he pledged to his wife. Now, the importance of marriage, when we think about the mid-19th century, in particular for black women, reoccurs as a sort of central theme, as I said, in albums. As the institution of slavery had prohibited marriage, or at the very least limited it, free African American women in this era took very seriously this need to be married. Not only the need to be married, but the badge of respectability that came with it, in a way that was quite different for others. I mean, I think Angelina Grimke was an example, or the Grimke's period, about what it also means to be unmarried for long periods of time. And Angelina's sister remains unmarried. But that within this sort of group of African American women, that the importance of marriage and the importance of keeping your husband by your side is central and not taken for granted. As Fortin's entry wished Cassey and her husband well, it served as a reminder of the significance as well as the respectability attached to marriage. Now, these are some of the, I tried to get some of the actual pages within Amy Cassey's album, and you can see they're quite lovely. The sort of watercolors, Butterfly by Sarah Mapps Douglas, who was a member of this Quaker meeting where Angelina Grimke left because of segregated seating. So clearly these women are seeing one another, they're talking to one another, but it also gives you an example of how long these albums would be kept with one another. So this is clearly something that would have taken a long time for Sarah Mapps Douglas to create. Women were not the only ones to contribute to the album. Friendship albums were shared between male friends as well, and acquaintances, and they were asked to add their writings and thoughts to the album. Although the overwhelming majority of writers appear to have been women, male members within the African American elite did contribute their sentiments. And they were very different. Their writing style was quite different. When I sat down, I was sort of comparing the writing between the men and the women. People like Sarah Fortin sort of wrote these long, sort of flowy, emotional poems that were actually represented or showed a fair amount of intimacy between her and Cassey. The male entries looked nothing like that. They were often very short. They were pieces that had been reproduced from other newspapers. They weren't original, and rarely original, meaning they weren't something written by them, not that they were things that had been copied from newspapers and pamphlets and what have you. They were often political. So we see this real sort of detachment in these friendship albums. And in several cases, the men who chose to write within the pages of the album explain this lack of sentimentality. Frederick Douglass wrote in Amy Cassey's album. In January of 1850, he wrote in Cassey's album, and Douglass was someone who, on the circuit, moved through Philly and New York and Boston quite frequently, and he knew the Cassey family. He was very connected to William Lloyd Garrison, and therefore connected to this family. So she asks Frederick Douglass to write in her album. Now, was she a very good friend of Douglass? No, she wasn't. But to have someone like Frederick Douglass write in your album, you know, that's like getting one of the head of the football, captain of the football team, right, to write in your yearbook. That, you know, it gives you that star power when you say, oh, Freddie wrote in my album. And he does so, but he does so reluctantly. And he writes, he sort of explains in January of 1850, in this very short entry that he writes into her album, why it's not a sort of natural thing for him to write with sentimentality or with intimacy. And he writes, quote, "I never feel more entirely out of my sphere than when presuming to write in an album. This suggestion of beauty, of elegance and refinement, while my habit of life past history and my present occupation have called into exercise all the sterner qualities of my head and heart." So Douglas explains that his inability to write something flowery and long and intimate, he connects it to two things. The first thing he connects it to is his history. And we can only assume that that means his history as an enslaved person. That his experience as an enslaved person in Maryland has clearly sort of, as well as the brutality of this experience, has changed him and made intimacy and sentimentality, at least in a very open kind of way, difficult. But he also notes that his present occupation, meaning that as an abolitionist, also called him to be distant. His life was dangerous. He was an agent of anti-slavery activity. And it was often considered incompatible with sentimentality. Douglas asks Cassey to forgive him for this short entry and completes his writing saying, "This, my dear friend, is my apology for not writing something becoming the pages of your precious album." So, as I said, Douglas sort of does so reluctantly. He doesn't really say much. He says nothing about Amy Cassey. He says nothing about her family, nothing about her husband. He just sort of explains why this is not natural for him. This is not something he's comfortable with. Yet he doesn't deny her. He agrees to sign it. Not only were these albums used to express feelings between friends, but they also served as emblems of etiquette, which becomes extremely important in the 1830s and 40s for free blacks. Friends and family shared poems and short stories that contained moral messages, often reminding one another about what is the appropriate role of a wife or the appropriate role of a mother. And because we don't have so many of the diaries as the ones that Carol worked with for her book, we often, this is a nice way to sort of interpret the feelings of these free black women. As women of the African American elite worked outside of the home, they often found it necessary to remind one another, and this is one of those odd moments in reading the diary, of the appropriateness of being dependent upon one's husband. Across the country, women such as Sarah Mapps Douglas, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Marianne Shedd Carey, all showed, and here are a couple examples. I put up some images of well-known black abolitionist Sarah Redmond Parker, who was born free in Boston and sort of became known for her work as an abolitionist. And hopefully you all are familiar with Harriet Jacobs. How many of you have you been able to use Harriet Jacobs or know? How many of you haven't heard of Harriet Jacobs? Oh, wow, a good number of you. Harriet Jacobs is often, when we teach African American slave narratives, she's often pitted against Douglas, right? We read Douglas's, how many of you read Douglas? Probably everyone. But we don't necessarily read about Harriet Jacobs, a woman who escaped slavery from North Carolina and eventually writes her narrative, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which actually works, I think, very well even for younger children, passages of it. And it's a nice example, a nice way to bring gender into this conversation about what slave narratives look like. Hers is quite different from from Douglas's, which speaks to his request for his apology to Amy Cassey. But there were many, and I just sort of brought up two images of female black abolitionists who I include when I teach. Sarah Fortin, as I mentioned before, was also one of them. She was a regular contributor to The Liberator and the North Star, Frederick Douglass's newspaper. Ironically, elite status and the desire for respectability reinforced the stereotype of the weaker sex. So I'm going to read to you a sonnet. It was unsigned, which I think is interesting, from Amy's album, and it's called The Fair Sex. And it goes, when Eve brought woe to all mankind, old Adam called her woman. But when she wooed with love so kind, he then pronounced her woman. But now with folly and with pride, their husbands keenly trimming, the ladies are so full of whims that people call them women. This was unsigned in the album. The gender of the poem's author is unknown. However, its central conviction is quite clear. The stereotype of the whimsical, and perhaps even evil woman, was not an inappropriate or uncommon entry for even a friendship album. The religious condemnation of Eve and her centrality to earthly problems reinforced this sort of degraded position of women within 19th century communities. As African American men and women found the nucleus for community formation within the church, the incapability of women, or of woman, generated from the story of Adam and Eve, placed woman in a submissive position. She was unable to think reasonably, to act appropriately. She was whimsical. And in many ways, antebellum black women understood and reinforced this. This is one of those moments where you're reading this album, you're like, okay, she's involved in abolitionist activity, she's involved in free black communities. Why is there this crazy poem in her album that is basically degrading and demeaning of women? But in many of these entries, we see this sort of cloaked and sometimes not cloaked or unveiled use of the subjugation of women. As many women found themselves in positions of shared authority within their own households, often still they ascribed to many of the same beliefs and customs, as did wealthier white women. Although many black women were forced to work outside of the home for economic survival, they promoted the idea of the centrality of the home, as well as the duties of a good wife within it. As many middle-class white and black women shared common beliefs, marriage, family, home ownership in the era of slavery were understood as privileged and precarious, even for free urban northern blacks. They understood the duties of a good wife that were not just imitated, supposedly, by black women, but we see this in the poems. Once again, I'll read another one. This is a poem that was written by Mary Fortin, another member of the Fortin family to Amy Cassey. The title of her poem is called Good Wives. And it makes clear the sort of responsibility and the expectation of what a married woman, a free black married woman, should be. She writes, good wives to snails should be akin. Always their houses keep within, but not to carry fashion's hacks, all they are worth upon their back. Good wives like city clocks should chime, be regular and keep in time, but not like the city clocks allowed, be heard by all the vulgar crowd. Good wives like echoes still should do, speak, but when they are spoken to. but not like echoes most absurd, have forever the last word. Fortin's words not only indicate the importance of wifely duties, and this goes back to the sort of importance of marriage for a group of people who were denied marriage, but once again we see an example of this reinforcement of her subjugating the role of the wife within the home. Fortin's poem advised women to follow the example of the snail, always their houses keep within, reiterating once again the centrality of the home and really the adherence of middle-class etiquette that we see with women like the Grimke's and others whose lives change once they marry. Whenever these women marry, their lives change. Not only does she sort of talk about this middle-class etiquette, but the home also represents a safe space. And I think this is where we once again have to look at it through the lens of free black Northerners. It wasn't simply to stay in your home and to be a good wife and to listen to your husband. But the home represented, as I said, a safe space. Why is that important in the 19th century? Well, as kidnappers roam the streets of Philadelphia, as sexual violence was frequent, as well as physical violence, the home represents something very different for free black women. It wasn't just a place for your family, but it was a place of safety. So in many ways, we can imagine that Fortin is telling Amy Cassey and all those reading that that is the safest space at this moment in time when slavery still lives, and as they move forward, looking at the Civil War, which is still some time away. Being a good wife, as I said before, was also a reminder of respectability. It carried with it importance. In addition to her commentary on the role of a good wife, Fortin simultaneously addressed the issues of freedom and representation. I'll get to what this cartoon is in a moment, but I included it because it sort of reminds us of what the feel in the streets of a place like Philadelphia, what kinds of hostility there was for free blacks. The Antebellum years marked a period of heightened racial hostility within the Philadelphia community. And as African Americans in Philadelphia began to assert their freedom, one of the many criticisms attached to newly freed men and women was their overly decadent style of dress. Derogatory images were constantly reproduced in newspapers and prints, mocking the lavish style of dress exhibited by newly freed men and women. So, and we'll get to this, we'll look at some other images later on, but this is one of the cartoons that I wanted to show as we talk about this. New clothing and the adoption of Eurocentric speech patterns and mannerisms were often viewed as offensive to many whites. However, the majority of white America simply ridiculed black men and women for these expressions of freedom. E.W. Clay, a well-known Philadelphia sketch artist, was one of the most popular artists to exploit the image of the overdressed and newly freed black Philadelphian. His infamous sketches entitled Life in Philadelphia and disparaging comedic references of African American men and women were sold in pamphlets across the country and eventually overseas. They became widely accepted popular icons throughout the middle of the 19th century. So if we look at this, this image, how you find yourself, and we'll look later on, we'll be able to read this, how you find yourself this hot day. I can't read that on this hot weather, Miss Chloe. Pretty well, I thank you, Mr. Caesar, only I aspire too much. So clearly, when we look at this image, there are several things that jump out at us as being offensive, aside from the dress, the overly ornate hat, the sort of poking fun at the language and the misuse of words. But this is the kind of hostility that Amy Cassey and others survived and lived in on a day-to-day basis. And what's interesting, what's happening in Philadelphia in the 1830s and 40s, you know, fast forward to the end of the Civil War, we see the same things in the post-emancipation South. So historians like Jackie Jones have written quite a bit about what it means to assert your freedom. How do you show people that you are now a free person? Well, one of the things we see in Philadelphia in the 1830s and 40s is they do it through their dress. That by wearing new clothes, by wearing, quote, fancy clothes, that this was an emblem, an example of freedom, that you were not relegated to clothes made of coarse material. There were not examples of middle-class status. So this became a trope, a sort of example that women like Amy Cassey had to deal with. So if we go back to that poem that Sarah Fortin writes, she says, you don't carry fashion on your back. You're not a hack to it. You're not committed to it. She's actually pushing the issue of simplicity. And that for free middle-class black women, this was not a badge of respectability. Dressing up in these sort of overly decadent ways was not what the free black community on this road to civil war and eventually to freedom suggested was the right thing to do in Amy Cassey's album. And we'll come back to some of these these cartoons later on. Not only was the Friendship album a space in which African Americans could engage in these sort of personal writings, but it also served as a forum to talk about politics and political debates in the middle of the 19th century. And clearly this moves us closer to the Civil War. Topics such as slavery, moral reform, the removal of Native Americans from their homeland, all found their way into the pages of these Friendship albums. These were quite political albums. And let me sort of back up. These albums were also kept by white women, as I said before. Many of them were women who went off to school, and they met women that they were probably never going to see again once they left school, boarding school. So they asked their friends to write in these albums. Pretty much, they're comparable to the sort of everyday yearbook. There's nothing really sort of political in them the way that we see in Amy Cassey and these other albums. Discussion about removing Native Americans we don't see in other albums. Eventually, Amy Cassey's husband dies because he is a whole lot older than her, and she moves. She leaves Philadelphia. You know, that's one thing that's interesting. Whenever their husbands die, they pick up and move, and they start some new kind of life. There's this sort of rebirth in many of these narratives. But she moves to Salem, Massachusetts in the 1850s. And many of the entries starting in the 1850s came from her friends in Massachusetts as opposed to Philadelphia. Women such as Lucy Stone, Anna Warren Weston, well-known abolitionists and activists, wrote in her album. Weston wrote, and she made her abolitionist writings quite clear. And she wrote about the injustice associated with slavery. Weston wrote, 3 million men of God release free, and this America of ours are slaves. Lives dark with suffering, unremembered graves, behold the story of their destiny. And yet not merely because such things be, does every noble heart indignant burn, and from the sight of horror turn. And Weston's writings and many others, as I said, were quite political, not as personal as the ones that we see, or intimate as the ones we see in Philadelphia. Weston went on to write, "The bitter shame and anguish is that we, the 18 million strong and rich and great, proud of the memories those from Plymouth date, in Christ's own gospel swift our parts to claim, are yet the enslavers of the weak and the poor, or worse, the jailers at the prison door. This is the cause for anguish, this is the shame." So as we move closer and closer to this Civil War moment into the mid-1850s, many more of her entries focus on the issue of abolition, of ending slavery. It sort of shows this political trajectory in Cassey's life, but also in the country. Weston's entry regarding slavery most likely represented the feelings of many, if not all, of Cassey's friends in the area. However, William Lloyd Garrison, who, as we know, has sort of been pitched as the leader of the abolition, or the father of it, founded the American Anti-Slavery Society, the Liberator. He wrote an Amy Cassey's album. And it's interesting to compare his writing to Frederick Douglass's. So it also shows us, how connected Amy Cassey is to have someone like Garrison write in her album. Garrison wrote probably one of the longest entries in the entire album. I'm not going to read it because it takes too long. He was wordy. It was an original writing, and it was titled "The Abolition Cause." And it talked about many of the same things that Weston wrote about. But what's interesting, sort of talked about how important abolition is and how we must move the country toward ending slavery immediately. But he focused on something different. He focused on the importance of abolitionist work and how difficult and dangerous it was for abolitionists themselves. In many ways, he was writing to his audience. His audience, he perceived, by writing in Amy Cassey's album, was a black abolitionist audience. He wrote about how difficult, how dangerous the work of abolition could be, how time-consuming, how it could bring you to poverty, how it could bring you to near-death experiences. In many ways, he understood this album as being a place for him to connect with black abolitionists in his area. It allowed him entry into this semi-private and public world. And he also was able to focus on this idea of the abolitionist as a martyr, another thing that we see in most of his writings. So, in conclusion, friendship albums served really as a vehicle to draw communities of the elite black women together throughout the Northeastern Corridor. Although African American women were separated by geographical space, the black elite expected to see one another at social gatherings, at political functions. Albums maintained by these women represent a network of friends and acquaintances that would not be dismantled, but nurtured. Although Cassey lived in Philadelphia and spent a great deal of her childhood in New York, she often provided friends in Philadelphia with contacts and connections in her hometown. In 1837, a group of young African American women traveled to New York to attend a women's anti-slavery convention, where Cassey made arrangements for them to stay or board with her parents in order to protect them from the problems, the danger, the racism of trying to find accommodations. The sentimentalism of friendship was but one aspect of relationships between women and the black elite. Friends constantly visited each other. They wrote letters of introduction for one another. And at times they eased what could be a difficult journey into racially hostile environments. Friendship in this era before the Civil War was not a luxury. for many, it was a necessity. And we see that in the diaries, the albums rather, of Amy Cassey. Thanks.
Well, do we have some time for questions? Anyone have a question? Erica?
Yes.
You mentioned that that you were talking about the centrality of the home and the duties of the home, but that there was a precariousness to it. Was that because of divorce or some other
No,
issue?
I think my reference to the sort of precariousness of it, or the danger of it, really sort of reflected upon two things. One, the fact that families in most of the country throughout the slave South were never safe. That men, husbands and wives and children could be sold from each other at a moment's notice. But I think the other issue was about what the very serious poverty in the urban North, what it did to free black families, often forcing black women to basically hire out their children, to indenture them, taking them away from their care. One of the well-known abolitionist groups, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, which documented all of the sort of legal battles of free blacks suing for their freedom or trying to prove their freedom, they actually were involved in this indenturing out or hiring out of children, of free black children, whose parents simply could not care for them. One of the things about freedom in the urban North was that it did not guarantee you a place to live. It did not guarantee you food. It did not guarantee you much of anything except for some kind of day's labor. And oftentimes these women, the majority of whom were domestics, were forced to work inside the home of an employer, and there was no place for their children. So when we think about how difficult daycare is in the 21st century, imagine what that looked like in the 19th century, with most women having to work outside of the home for additional income. So I think it's twofold. This precariousness is sort of looking at what the family means in the enslaved South, but the difficulties that come with maintaining strong families in a free urban North. I think those are two major